Hey guys, what's up? It's Kyle with Hagerty, and today we're going through how to build your own gaskets for whatever project you might be working on in the garage. So there's three main reasons that you may need to make your own gaskets. And the first is the most obvious, a custom application fitting two parts together that were never meant to be together from the factory. The second is that the piece is no longer available, and that happens in old cars pretty regularly. And the third is just that you might not have time to wait for the gasket to arrive, and making your own just makes sense. In this case, it is a carburetor base gasket for a Corvair cylinder head. These are readily available and I can order them online, but if I needed one quicker than that, this is a perfect template to make. So we're gonna go ahead and make one of those, and let's take a look at the materials that we'll need to do it. So there is a variety of materials that you can use to make your own gaskets, but what I recommend starting with is going out to your local auto parts store and grabbing a kit like this one that I picked up from Felpro. Something like this is going to come with 4 materials that you can use, as well as a recommendation for each material as to what to use it for. So with these, you can get a couple different types. So a cork rubber sheet, which is this standard, some people would even almost call it a paper material. That's gonna match up what we're gonna be using today, and that can be used for oil, coolant, and gasoline, typically recommended for air cleaners or carburetor base gaskets. A cork rubber sheet is more of a traditional cork style material, and that is good for oil, coolant, and gasoline as well. Something like this you might be using on a surface that has more variance to it, or material that you need to get to flatten out. So you can see that's a little bit thicker than the paper material. So that's going to be a good one if you have something that's not as flat. The last, or the third to last, is this rubber cellulose sheet. This one's pretty thick, but that's mainly for if you're doing a water pump gasket or something that's only going to see water and coolant. That's going to be best for sealing those materials. And the last is another rubber fiber sheet. And this one has a little bit more material to it and is even thicker yet. And that is going to still be safe for oil, coolant, gasoline, something like this for a fuel pump, or even a maybe a remote oil filter adapter, something like that is going to be perfect to take up any of the variants and get a nice compression fit. But those are the 4 main materials that are going to do most of the gaskets on your engine. There are other materials available, and for specific applications, they might fit. But this is going to do 99% of what you're going to need. So now we've arrived at the tools portion, and there is 2 ways to accomplish any given task, especially this one. The first is the simple DIY method, using just a few things that you probably already have in your toolbox, and the second requires a few specialty tools. Now remember, they accomplish the same task. We're going to make the same gasket twice. One will just come out looking a little bit nicer and maybe fit slightly better, but they will still work the same. Using the simpler kit, standard household kitchen shears that you might have out in the garage, and an X-Acto knife or a razor knife or even just a razor blade will accomplish the task. I recommend upgrading to a nice set of dedicated shears like these that I keep out in my garage. Keep them sharp, don't cut anything metallic with them, and they will treat you well for years. And they cut a little bit nicer than standard scissors. In terms of using a razor blade, I like to use a razor knife like this one because it gives me a little bit more control. I'm less likely to cut myself than just holding onto a bare razor blade or using a snap knife of those type. So recommend those tools if you're gonna go down that path. If you're going down the other path, get ready to spend a little bit of money, but I promise you that it is worth it. Now you can get a leather punch set, and something like this will duplicate over to gasket making. And it's a very simple piece. All it is a precision hole on the end, and then it is cut on a slight taper so that when using that with a hammer, you can hit down on that and it will cut your perfect hole down on the bottom. Something like this is always going to turn out a more professional looking hole and a better fitting hole than using a razor knife. But you spend a little bit more money. And if you're going to spend the money, I highly recommend stepping up to a kit like this one. So there's a couple benefits here, and the main one is these larger dies that you're able to go with. So even if you're cutting something that is a little bit goofy, you can use the radius of these to cut an edge. So you might not necessarily need a hole that large, but to use the edge of that to accomplish a shape that you're using. This also comes with a handle that you thread the dies onto, which is nice because then you run a little bit less risk of smacking yourself on the hand or taking off a finger. And of course, you'll just need a nice little ball peen hammer, something to strike with. I prefer to use a ball peen over a carpenter's hammer or anything like that, just because that's what I keep in the garage rather than a carpenter's hammer. And in a case like today, I also have a block of wood because I do not want to dull my punch sets by putting that directly onto the steel table. So I want to have something that punch can sink into ever so slightly when I hit it without damaging the punch itself. So we're going to start with the first method, which is the easiest. And the first tip that I want to give you on cutting this out is to not waste your material. So if you have something to trace, make sure you're going to use all the way to the edge of your material. This has a straight edge on it. Go ahead and use the straight edge of this sheet of gasket paper, and then I'm going to go all the way up to the edge over here because I never know what the next thing I'm going to cut out of this paper will be, and so I might as well leave as much of it as I can for the next project. So clamp this down, make sure to hold it where it should be. So this one's ripped, so I want to put that together and then get it clamped down just a little bit with my fingers and mark that out and draw it all at once. So we'll get all of our edges here. And then the back side as well. And then also all three holes. The next step you'll want to do is to actually start with cutting out the holes. And it seems a little counterintuitive compared to cutting out the larger shape right away, but this gives you more material to grab onto as you're cutting these. And if you make mistakes, you're not ruining a large chunk of the gasket paper. I'm going to start with cutting it out with my razor knife, and that is on one of these smaller holes, and then we'll go over and show you how to use one of the punch sets on these other two. And so the trick here is to just be patient and careful. And you're not going to be able to get a perfect line every time. You can see I've got some wood placed underneath, so I've got something for my knife to dig into. And just slow, careful pressure as I work through this. It's gonna be difficult to get a perfect circle out of this, but you can usually get fairly close if you're very careful. And if chunks are getting in the way, just cut across that or make a star pattern, and that will allow you to remove pieces like that. So you do want to make sure that as you're cutting this out, that you're cutting out far enough that it fits over the stud or the bolt that needs to pass through it will go through without catching the material. Because if you cut this too small, it might ripple the gasket or cause a tear. And if that gasket's not flat, it's not going to seal properly. So making sure that everything is cut to the appropriate size will help make it work properly. So there you can see that is actually enough of a hole to fit over the stud that this gasket needs to. It's not pretty, but it will seal, and that's the trick here. You're making a gasket, it's not necessarily going to be seen all the time. So now that we've got one hole cut with the razor blade or X-Acto knife method, I'll show you how to use the punch set to do the other two. And the biggest thing on these is to size the punch appropriately. And you just kind of grab and see what fits. And the key thing to remember is it is the inside diameter of this punch that you need to pay attention to. Because like this one, if you were sizing it similar to a drill bit, this would be the size that you need. But that would actually be too small for the stud that we're putting that over. So if we go up one size here, you can see that that inner diameter just fits. And that would be the perfect appropriate size for this application. Get your punch good and centered on your material, and just a single strike. You can see that cut a perfect hole in a way that I never could by hand. And this is one of the nice parts of using a larger punch set like this one, is you end up with these larger dies that will accomplish these tasks and make life a lot easier for you. So it looks like this one is right at that 1¼ inch. So we will thread our die onto the handle, and get it centered up. There it is. You can see there, it cuts a perfect circle, that 1.25" diameter. And yet again, I could do that by hand, but it would not come out nearly as cleanly. Now that my holes are cut out, I can go ahead and trim around the exterior of this to get the overall shape and know that I'm not going to be wasting any material. And a trick when cutting material like this is to turn the material when you're trying to cut around a corner compared to turning your scissors. It usually tends to end up with a straighter, well, with a better rounded edge than if you were to turn your cutting device. So you can see here, that is our gasket that we were templating off of. We can place them over top of each other and just make sure everything is going to fit properly. And it looks just perfect, ready to use. The next thing we're going to touch on is if you don't have a gasket to work off of or create a template from, that means you're going to have to template the part itself directly onto your gasket paper. And so in this case, it is the bottom of this carburetor, and this is the same gasket that we just made. We're just making it as if we did not have the piece that we were doing. And so you set this down, make sure that it is all the way on the paper, and then you go about tracing that out. And one tip here is I do use a pencil to mark things out, not only because you can go back and erase the marks that you might make on the paper, but also because it comes down to a finer point. And that allows you to get right up against the object that you're working on. So to locate the holes that I'm going to draw on that gasket paper, what I like to do is use a piece of paper. And this is just standard copy paper, white paper, and I can mark my end and then where that center line crosses each of the holes. And this will kind of give me a storyline of sorts. Now that I've got those small marks that denote each of the holes, and then transfer those marks over to my gasket paper. And there we have it. We'll cut it out, and we can see here, if we compare it to our perfect gasket that we made previously, it actually came out really good. The last tip here is if you've got something really weird or you're going completely custom, is to use a little bit of tape. So what you're going to do is tape over the gasket surface that you need the gasket for. And of course, always use painter's tape or some other tape that's going to release from the part that you need it to come off of. Run my finger around the edge to get a real definite edge, a razor blade or a sharp knife, because you'll come back and dress it up later. So start with the side that is at the very bottom of the overlap. There we go. Just being real gentle so as to not distort what we've created. Then we can take that, put that directly onto our gasket paper. And we now have a very nice template that you can use to cut out the exact piece that you need. So using that tape trick might be just the ticket if you have something that is very custom or oddly specific in locating all of those holes. Of course, it requires some cleanup and some detailing as you transfer it to the gasket paper, but it just might help you on your project. Hopefully all of these did, and if you like this video, be sure to subscribe down below and tune in for future DIY tips.